This is the Enjoyer Podcast. I'm your host, James Dixon. Beware politicians who come promising fundamental change. Oftentimes they mean it. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, Kamala Harris's running mate in November, is the living embodiment of the regime's governing philosophy: build back better. To do this, first you got to trash the place. You have to flatten the earth. You have to salt the fields. You have to pull pages from history books. You have to pull down statues from the public square. In the total state, there are no before times. There's only a permanent present where you follow the last set of talking points. People are reduced to sheep in an animal farm. 2 legs bad, 4 legs good. 4 legs good, 2 legs better. Your job as a member of the movement is to bleat and repeat the party line, never to question it. Many foot soldiers on the left have made exactly this agreement. There's many things I can say about Walz. Other people are hitting the stolen valor angle pretty hard and they're doing great work. But I'll start here. Tim Walz wants to change your state flag. As vice president, he would come for the American flag. Just a few months ago in May, Minnesota embraced a new state flag. A version of the old state flag had been in use since 1893. The old state flag carried the Minnesota state slogan, the Star of the North, in French. It shows a white man working the fields, just as Cain would have done. It shows an Indian man riding a horse. It shows water and hills in the distance. It looks like the land of plenty. It's a beautiful flag for a state that used to be beautiful. Why change what works? There's been some talk that the old flag was racist, but as enjoyers, we know to discount such things. We look at the flag for ourselves. We see no such thing. That a white man and a non-white man are depicted on the same flag is not proof of racism, actually. Just the opposite. Why can't we all get along? Well, as the late Livia Soprano said, some people don't wanna. And for those people, division serves their purposes best. Tim Walz is one of those people. Since 1957, the year my mom was born, Minnesota has had versions of the same flag with only modest changes. But even that 1957 flag has its roots in the 1893 flag. The 2024 flag is a total break from the past. So if the 1957 flag was an art project, the 1893 flag has an ambition that we would hardly recognize today. Try bending your brain around the idea of a reversible flag. White on the front, blue on the back. You can't. You can't think of a printer who could deliver this. You can't think of the artist who would design it. You can't imagine the politicians who would approve it. The 1893 flag is a taste of the craftsmanship and overall high effort level of the old world. 2024 campaign season has found a lot of people in Michigan saying, we don't want to go back. In my day job, I cover Michigan as a swing state for the New York Post. On election day, I went out to talk to voters in Detroit. I don't want to go back was mentioned at least 3 times by different people. Whitmer said it at the Kamala Harris rally recently. It's clearly a talking point the Democrats are going to lean on. The problem is when we study history, we lose that impulse to think of ourselves as a better breed of human or more advanced than our ancestors. We might know a little bit more than they do, but they made great use of what they had without our many advantages. So back when an artist in Minnesota was designing a reversible state flag, Henry Ford was in Detroit tinkering in his auto garage. The Wright brothers were down in Ohio and Dayton making the transition from bicycles, the hot technology of the 1890s, to the airplane, a technology that changed war and the world. Before cars drove roads or planes flew skies, there were men of ambition working on impossible dreams. Today, 13 decades later, grown men go about searching for microaggressions at work and they call HR when they find them. We didn't just lose our explorer spirit, it was trained out of us by public schools in the corporate America. People respond to incentives, and in 2024, the incentives in America are to claim victimhood and wait for the refs to give you recourse. So in a sense, going back would be a blessing, not a curse. But that's not how the progressive mind is wired. I remember once interviewing Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, sometimes of Dearborn, sometimes of Detroit. I forget the specific thing we were talking about, but I'll never forget what Tlaib said that day. She explained that progressives are always looking for the next thing. They take today's win or loss and look for tomorrow's problem to solve. What happens when they don't find one? They create one. And a public whose minds have been dulled by public schools, mainstream media, and social media is too dumbed down to notice. You may remember this as a listener of the Enjoyer podcast, but Minnesota actually burned 4 years ago after the death of St. George Floyd in Minneapolis. Tim Walz was governor back then, and he did everything in his power to make sure the riots would have maximum impact. When the mayor requested 600 National Guardsmen at the height of the action, Walz waited 2 days before sending him 100. It was on official instructions from the highest levels that the Minneapolis Police 3rd Precinct was allowed to be overtaken and burned. Tim Walz's decisions made Minnesota an uglier and more violent place. A Twin Cities region that's been a northern gem for decades is now bleeding people. Residents know that when the revolution comes to town, Tim Walz won't protect them. He'll let their city burn. He'll tell the police to stand down. So they left. Gwen Walz, Tim's wife, described in almost erotic terms, we're going to show you the video. She described in almost erotic terms the thrill she got from smelling the burning tires during the riots.
I would say those first days, when there were riots, I could smell the burning tires. And that was a very real thing. And I kept the windows open for as long as I could because I felt like that was such a touchstone of what was happening.
Gwen Walz said she slept with the windows in her house open to let the smell in. Your ruin is their kink. Their daughter cozied up with rioters, even tweeting to let people know that the National Guard would not be mobilized at the very height of the violence. The Walzes did not merely sympathize with the people who burned their city, they aided and abetted in the fall of Minneapolis. And now I have a homework assignment for you. If you've not seen the documentary by that name, The Fall of Minneapolis, you need to check it out this weekend. Get to know the land of George Floyd. That's how you're going to get to know the man who was chosen to lead it, who instead of leading it, cheered as it was burned, and police retired, and people fled. That's what Build Back Better looks like. You flatten the earth. You torch the place. Then, many years later, too late to matter for the people who live there now, you rebuild it in your image. So if Tim Walz gets to the White House, there's a good chance the mayor of Minneapolis would take his place as the next governor. So guess who would then be in line for every federal handout? Guess who would be free to build back better with unlimited amounts of federal cash? Now do you get it? Minnesota is an anti-success story. It's not normal that a running mate would be chosen from a small state who's known for making life in that state worse in every measurable way. Until you realize that that's why Tim Walz is here. He's not Kamala Harris's running mate because he's a good man or a good politician. He isn't. He's there because his every action would weaken and destabilize America. Tim Walz is here because of his track record of failure, not despite it. This is a man who married his wife on the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre in China. A man who's had a fascination with communist China for 35 years. Asked about their anniversary date, Gwen Walz said that Tim wanted to choose a date he would always remember. Tim Walz is 60. He owns no stocks, no bonds, no assets, nothing of value, no home, and no religion too. Imagine. He owns nothing, and he loves it. Look, nobody likes it when a Nancy Pelosi uses her inside knowledge from politics to make the exact right bets in the stock market. But instinctively, we all understand it. We curse politicians for doing this, but we look at the ones who don't do it with almost a side eye. There's still part of the American ethic that says if you're not cheating, you're not trying. I admit I'm a believer in this. So Pelosi we get, We don't like it, but we get it. In our bones, we get it. This is a person using the power they have for maximum impact and for their own good. You'd probably do that. I'd probably do that, right? Until someone stops you. But the only thing more American than stealing a fortune is earning one. So Tim Walz is 60 and he hasn't done either? It's a popular line among neo-communists, the World Economic Forum types, that you will own nothing and love it. Tim Walz is the prototype. In Michigan, the World Economic Forum was invited in with open arms. Michigan, under Gretchen Whitmer, actually paid money. Michigan and my home county, Oakland County, each paid $3 million to partner up with the World Economic Forum. Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan has also invited them in. So at the highest levels of Michigan politics, too, there are believers in Build Back Better. Tim Walz is a man who didn't get a kiss from his wife on their first date, who slept in different rooms from his wife on their honeymoon. This is a man who took a lead role in connecting with gay and lesbian youth as a high school teacher in the 90s. A man who shook his wife's hand in his first appearance on the national stage. Is that the life you want for yourself? A fake Clinton-style marriage? No money, no assets to pass down to your kids? Well, it's the life you would get if Tim Walz gets anywhere near the White House. After the George Floyd riots, people left the Twin Cities and Minneapolis in big amounts. According to one report, Minneapolis lost about 50,000 people between 2020 and 2022. Up in Minnesota, 2023 is actually viewed as a success story because only 4,700 people left. Now, there's no such thing as Minnesota nice. There's damn sure no Minnesota success story. So what did Tim Walz do in the face of this shrinking population? He decided Minnesota should change its state flag. White progressives love to call everything racist because by making that accusation, nobody focuses on their own racism. People tend to follow the accusing finger, not to assess the character of the accuser. And so there's nothing a white progressive loves more than being offended on someone else's behalf. This is a good amount of our problem right now. Rooms full of white men who don't sleep with their wives will sit around and dream up what might be offensive to a black person, or the imaginary woman, or the imaginary gay person, or maybe the gay person who stares themselves in the mirror. And then they'll act like they're the defenders of these people. It's 100% self-serving, and it only works on broken souls who experience no love and mistake obvious pandering for love. So when some fat white guy says he wants to change your state flag, everybody says, yes, queen. This is stunning and brave. I wish there'd been some reluctance in the process, some realization that it's good to leave well enough alone. But again, that's not how the progressive mind is wired. George Floyd was dead, and the white men needed something to make them feel not racist. So what did they do? They read racism into a state flag that shows the white man and the red man getting along peacefully. Any study of American history would find that white and Indian relations are not always as peaceful as what's depicted on that 1893 flag. Their coexistence in that primitive age when the state was founded, once upon a time, this was viewed as proof of concept, proof that we were all in this together once and could be again, that this land was our land, all of our land. To judge men for the content of their character and not the color of their skin was a radical concept in that ancient world. The 1893 flag predates MLK's ministry by decades, and the events it depicts predates MLK by about a century. Only the empty soul of the progressive could look at all that progress and want to erase it. But that's what Build Back Better demands. We have to pretend that the past and the men in it were all bad. There's too many white men with too much power. The U.S. Constitution is a racist document because Michelle Obama didn't write it. This is the way they think. Listen to them. They actually say this stuff. Look, you can love Minnesota and its people and want to modify their flag, and there's a way to do that respects history. Personally, if I were doing it, I would depict a mother and a child somewhere, add them somewhere to the existing image. Or maybe it'd be two women, one white and one Indian. They'd be getting pedicures and drinking lemonades as their husbands work the land. But I get why they're not there. The scene in the flag, the original flag, represents Minnesota in its most primitive state. This was the Minnesota of the explorer who conquers the wild, not the Minnesota of the settler who sends for his family once things were tame. So if I was going to add anything, I'd say, hey, things are tame now. It is safe enough for women and children, or at least it was before Tim Walz let Minnesota burn. With his state burned and his population in decline, Tim Walz decided that was a good time to redesign the state flag. Not surprisingly, the winner was submitted by a white progressive, a 21-year-old version of Walz. In an interview with CBS News, Andrew Precker, the designer, said, and I quote, "For me, it's an important change that is necessary to be inclusive to all people in Minnesota, especially our indigenous communities and tribal nations." That's inclusion in the progressive mind, going from a flag that depicts the white man and the Indian man coexisting to a flag without any people on it. I could tell you that progressives are anti-human in their choices and impulses. I'm reading a book right now, Unhumans, by my friend Joshua Lysek on this very topic. We're going to have Joshua on someday. I could tell you that, but I'd just as soon show you. Let's show everybody a picture of the new Minnesota flag. The CBS story adds, right now Minnesota's flag shows a white settler tilling land as an indigenous man rides off on horseback. Many consider the imagery racist. Obviously, it's not racist. Anyone with a brain and a working set of eyes would see just the opposite. If anything, the old flag depicts the very progress that men like Tim Walz claim to support. But that's the real problem here, isn't it? The 1893 flag depicts coexistence long before the coexist bumper sticker. It depicts content of character long before MLK. And it depicts a state that was happy and thriving long before Tim Walz arrived with his plans to build back better. A few years ago, also in the era of George Floyd, the city of Detroit removed a bus from Christopher Columbus. The Italians in Detroit had placed the bus downtown a century prior, back when Columbus was still seen as an explorer. Today he's maligned as a colonizer. What did Mike Duggan do, Detroit's mayor? What did he do? Did he call on us to wrestle with history like adults would? No. He removed the bus. Because with average men, what did Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan do? Did he call on us to wrestle with history like adults would? No. No, he pulled down the bust. Because average men like Mike Duggan can only elevate themselves by eliminating great men like Columbus from history. And so our schools teach that Christopher Columbus was a colonizer, not an explorer. Henry Ford was a racist, not the man who put the world on wheels. Thomas Jefferson's a guy who had an affair with a black lady, not the author of the Declaration of Independence. This is life in the permanent present. A Detroit high school named for Dr. Ben Carson was actually forced to change its name after Carson served in the first Trump administration. But over in Detroit, the name of Lewis Cass still reigns over at Cass Tech. Cass in the 1840s preached the gospel of popular sovereignty, which was basically, if you like your slavery, you can keep it. So Detroit has room for Lewis Cass, but not for Ben Carson. And think about what that CBS story said. Imagery that many people believe to be racist. And it left it there. The story never explores who those people are, why they say this, or the validity of the claims themselves. No, a claim of racism was made and a claim of racism was printed. News is written for the Andrew Preckers of the world. Young people who can't perceive of a world before 2008. People who hear the word racist and they don't ask for details, they just run in the opposite direction out of fear. If you were not stupid before consuming mainstream news, you surely will be afterward. Don't let yourself get preckered by watching the news without discernment. This is why I harp on critical thinking skills, the thing behind the thing, because the alternative is swallowing whole every fake storyline the media throws your way. You may not know this, but a similar effort is afoot in Michigan to change our state flag. It's led by the Tim Walz of Michigan, State Rep Phil Skaggs, a Democrat, surprisingly a Democrat. from the Grand Rapids area. Skaggs hasn't articulated any real reason to change the state flag. He hasn't even made a fake claim of racism. And again, this is what you must get about how progressives think. Since 2008 and Barack Obama, every Democrat in America has been promising fundamental change. Not one of them said they were going to improve America, and not one of them has improved America. These days, the possibility of improvement doesn't even come up. It's not even mentioned. These days, there's no hope on the ballot anymore, just change. Beware politicians who come promising fundamental change. Oftentimes, they mean it. As we saw in Minnesota, this change involves deleting who we are and who we were. The permanent present has no place for history. If it did, we'd have to admit that the white men of old weren't all bad, nor the governments they created, nor the flags they designed. And if they were, I wouldn't be here. If white men were what the Tim Walzes of the world claim, the red men in the original flag would have been the horse, not riding a horse. That a world existed before Tim Walz, where people got along as best they could, argues against any need to build back better. It shows we don't need fundamental change, actually. What we need is to keep on keeping on. Irony of ironies, isn't it? That the so-called progressives are actually the biggest enemy of progress. They don't want us to do better. They don't want us to be better. They're here to wreck the place, and they say it all the time. That wreckage is an essential player in their vision. It's the only way we'd let them build back better, and it's the only way we'd need to. So if you want to see America burn, if you want to see the pride flag become the new American flag, if you want to be asked and then ordered to let an illegal immigrant use the spare room in your house, Harris Walz is the way to go in 2024, 100%. Choose wisely. The way things are going, we'll only be able to choose once.